pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Carolyn Blackstock. Is that better?
Yeah.
And Carolyn lives in Kitchener, and she's very well known in this area, particularly in the Waterloo region. She's kind of the Waterloo region. She probably doesn't like this analogy to Julie and Julia, because you're going to find out about what her project has been. But she is a historian. She did a bachelor's degree in history and psychology from Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo. And she became very much involved in heritage presentations and museum work. So she has been in done work at a number of historic sites. The first one being the Oil Museum of Canada. That wasn't cooking oil, by the way. In Oil Springs near Petrolia in southwestern Ontario. Then she moved to this region and she got a job at the Dune Heritage Crossroads, which now, of course, is where the Waterloo Regional Museum is located. She also has done interpretive work at Joseph Schneider House in Kitchener, the Seagram Museum when it was in existence, the Ontario Agricultural Museum in Milton, and Woodside most recently, until, of course, our favorite government decided in its wisdom that we had too many people working in historic sites across the nation, and decided that Woodside, which is only the childhood home of William Lyon Mackenzie King, should just be self-guided tours maybe for a couple months of the summer. And so, unfortunately, Carolyn was part of that cutback. However, being the very resourceful person she is, she launched in almost, maybe it was by accident, a new career, almost, because she found a copy of the 1906 Berlin Women's Cookbook. And she started she dedicated herself in the year 2012, which you will recall was a leap year, to every day making a recipe from that book and then blogging about it in a very informative and entertaining fashion. So you can find her still online, all her blogs. And as I said prior to lunch, those, basically what you ate, was taken from the Berlin Cookbook of 1906, maybe gussied up a little bit. And so I'm going to just say, please welcome Carolyn, and we're really looking forward, Carolyn, to hearing about your experience as a historian blogger.
Well, thank you very much. Whoops. Okay, let's get this in the right spot. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. And I talk loud anyway, so it's talking for many, many years over 6-year-olds, whole classes of 6-year-olds. As Gail said, this delicious lunch shows the skill of the restaurant team here at the Elmhurst, but it also demonstrates that a cookbook published in 1906 has something to show us today. The beefsteak was one of the recipes, the baked cabbage, the spinach a la creme, the maple mousse that was part of that cake. That was a recipe from the cookbook. I'm forgetting one. Baked cabbage, did I say that? Oh, parsnips, the escalloped parsnips was also from the cookbook. And the salmon patties, how can I forget those? Yes. That was one of the big surprises for me, was that when I made them, that they were actually really good. Some foods were a surprise. The fact that these recipes exist is thanks to approximately 300 women who contributed recipes to a community cookbook. As we heard earlier, community cookbooks have a long history in Canada. And while you enjoy your dessert, I'm going to tell you a bit about this particular one, the Berlin Cookbook, and some of the women involved in its creation. We'll begin by traveling back in time. So sit back, relax, no transportation is involved, except your imagination. It is, this stopped again, there we go. It is 1905 or 06, and you live in the town of Berlin. Berlin, Ontario. The town has not become a city yet, and its name hasn't changed to Kitchener. You are one of the 12,000 people who are living and working in this vibrant community. There are many places to work and to shop, to attend worship services. There is efficient transportation within the town and to surrounding areas. You have a choice of amusements. Entertainment, including touring shows, circuses, and even moving pictures. There are a variety of ways to do good works, and all sorts of clubs to join. There is a hospital and a beautiful big park. The high school has recently added a manual arts and household science department. Busy Berlin is thriving. One day, you hear about a special fundraising project. A cookbook is being created, and you or your mother or sister or daughter has been asked to contribute a few of your favorite recipes. You carefully write out some recipes and give them to the cookbook coordinator. In your weekly letter to a friend or relative far away, you mention what you submitted, and she decides to share her favorite recipe too. Every so often you hear that the cookbook is almost ready. It is going to be printed by the Berlin News Record and available for sale. On June 27, 1906, you open that newspaper and see the first ad for the Berlin Cookbook. Sometime during the next few weeks, you take your money, 75 cents,
oh yeah.
There we go. This is it. 75 cents. You take that money to either St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran Church, that's the minister's house, or stop in at Potter's hardware store. You search the pages of the cookbook for your recipes, and unless you are one of the important people in town, this is probably the only time you've seen your name in print. You try some of the recipes in the copy of the Berlin Cookbook. Perhaps you buy another copy to give to some friends. Eventually, years later, a few copies of this cookbook find their way to archives. One of the books is microfilmed and can be printed by request. And that's where I come into the story. I first discovered the Berlin Cookbook over 20 years ago while working at a historic site in Kitchener. I eventually bought a copy of the printed version for myself. It looked better then. It's had hard use for a year. The fact that this cookbook was available at the minister's house and the hardware store is the reason I think it did not gain the popularity that the Home Cookbook and the Gulp Cookbook did, two other well-known reprinted community cookbooks. That's my theory at this point. I don't know for sure. Excuse me. On December 30th, 2011, I decided I wanted a challenge. I was a bit bored. I wasn't able to do historic cooking right then, and thought it might be fun to try cooking from the Berlin Cookbook every day for the entire year of 2012. And to keep me committed, I decided to write about it in a blog, something I hadn't done before. I wanted to report how I made the recipe, so the techniques, how it turned out, and I also wanted to find out about the person who contributed the recipe. And so I started on January 1st, 2012. I named it, as Gail said, it was a leap year, 366 Days with the Berlin Cookbook. It's on WordPress. I was able to cook, blog, and do basic research at home every evening after work. This became a bit more challenging when a water shutoff valve blew and flooded my house from top to bottom. It's an 1888 three-story home. That was April 4th. So I found it wonderful that when Gail asked me to be here on April 6th, it was vindication. The worst part was I was reduced to living in one room and cooking in a variety of makeshift ways. I cooked in a hotel room. I cooked without a stove. I used other people's kitchens, all kinds of things. But at this point, I knew enough about some of the recipe contributors to realize that some of them had had a far more difficult life. Even when I lost my job a month later, I knew that I was still living in better circumstances than some of the women immortalized in the Berlin Cookbook. So who were the women who contributed recipes back in 1905 or 06? As the ad said, there are over 1,000 recipes in this cookbook, and I counted over 300 different people contributing recipes. I can't possibly tell you about all of them. So I've selected a few to represent the rest. Let's start with the woman that I think started the entire thing. I believe this cookbook would not exist without the work of Matilda Overlander. Her parents, Alexander and Matilda, were living in Syracuse, New York, when she was born in 1874. And I've discovered that many of the women contributing recipes were born around the 1870s. Makes sense, these would be her friends. She was one of 11 children. This picture is of some of them in their adult years. Her father was first a doctor and then a Lutheran minister. Several of her siblings followed their father into medicine, including one of her sisters, which I also thought was interesting. Her brother, Frederick E. Overlander, became a minister. In 1905, he came to Canada to become the minister at St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Berlin, Ontario. Maida came with them. The brother-sister team seemed to be very successful in the community. Frederick and Maida left Berlin in 1915 to settle in New York City, so they didn't stay very long here. I think Maida either initiated the cookbook or at the very least coordinated it. She has over 17 recipes in the cookbook, often with variations of her name. Maybe she's hiding the fact that she's coordinating it. I tried at least 11 of her recipes. The odds were when I picked a recipe, it was going to be one of hers. The timing of her arrival in the town of Berlin matches 1905, cookbook probably initiated in 1905. Her sister Matilda was married to George Potter of the hardware store, the other location to buy the cookbook. Women connected to the wealthy industrialists in Berlin and surrounding areas contributed many of the recipes. Names like Bright Up, they had a tannery, the Bolbys, the Rumpels of the felt industry, the Seagrams of the distilling industry are scattered throughout. I've selected the Rumpels to represent these women. Mrs. George Rumpel, her daughter Hilda, married daughter Olga, and daughter-in-law Mrs. Oscar Rumpel provide wide-ranging types of recipes. They weren't all the sort of extensive things that you might expect of a wealthy family. Wilhelmina Hartmann was born in Germany. She and her husband, George Rumpel, lived in Hamilton when their first son, Oscar, was born. Later, they adopted her sister's child and then went on to have another son and 2 daughters. When she is sick in 1907 and requires an operation, her husband refuses to leave town, even though he's been asked to attend a big Lutheran conference. She remains ill for quite a long time and requires a special corset so that she can walk. All of this is documented in their family letters. They don't mention the cookbook, though. The son, Oscar, married Ada Hilborn, and she was the mother of 2 small children when she shared her recipes for Welsh rarebit, German apple cake, lemon pie, and rice croquettes. There are 4 recipes for Welsh rarebit, spelled in various ways in this particular cookbook. It's one of 2 where there's multiples of that particular recipe. The other one is maple cream candy, my favorite one. Every single one of them was good. George and Oscar own a felt boot company and are very successful. The family lives well. They have a cottage in Penetanguishene, a boat. Among George's business correspondence are invoices and letters about his wife and daughter's clothes, furs from Toronto and Montreal. Olga Rumpel is just a few years younger than her brother Oscar. And she marries an employee of the felt boot company, Harry Dale McKellar. He's Scots background. And their wedding is written up in the newspaper. It was held at St. Peter's Lutheran Church. It only appeared in the German language paper. There were over 100 guests and other people crowded the church and even out to the street. The refreshments were provided by a company in Toronto, and so were the flowers. So this is not a family that's making the wedding cake recipe in the cookbook. There's quite a few of those too. She is a 2-year-old little girl and is pregnant with her second child when the cookbook is advertised. I was startled to read their address in a 1907 directory. It was the same as mine. Then I realized that it was probably the western end of the street instead of the eastern where I live. Although I like my house, it's a working man's house. I think it would be a little too humble for Mrs. Harry D. McKellar. Olga eventually had 2 more children and they moved to a bigger home. Now, the image here is of Hilda Louise Rumpel. She was the youngest child, and she was born 7 years after the previous youngest. Her mother was in her late 40s, so you can already probably imagine a little bit about Hilda. She was a fortunate young woman. She went away to a ladies' college